name is Silva, as Alex said, and I am up here at Cornell University working on a PhD in natural resources. And at the same time, I continue to run a small citizen science-based nonprofit in New York City called TreeKit, which helps volunteers measure and map and collaboratively manage urban ecosystems. And I'm involved in another project, which I'm going to talk about today, which is called Five Borough Farm, which is like TreeKit, an effort to help city dwellers start to get a sense of all the good things that are coming out of the community gardens and urban farms located in their neighborhoods. And I'll get into that in just a bit once we bring up some slides, but that pretty much covers my background for today. I briefly mentioned Five Borough Farm, which is an initiative of the Design Trust for Public Space in New York City. The Design Trust is a fantastic organization that has been working in New York for a number of years on instigating creative and design-based solutions to any number of different urban puzzles and problems. And Five Borough Farm came about a handful of years ago as policymakers and funders and folks in the urban agriculture and community gardening world were starting to realize that they needed a smarter way to talk about community gardens and urban farms. They needed to finally really make a strong evidence-based case for the benefits that gardens and farms create for cities in order to really solidify the importance of those spaces in cities for years to come. And so the Design Trust stepped up and created a platform for having that discussion. The Five Borough Farm Initiative is focused on a number of different efforts to reveal the benefits of gardening. The work that I've been focused on, along with my longtime collaborator, Liz Barry, is on really developing simple and accessible ways of measuring those good things that are happening in our gardens. You know, a number of us read journal articles and even newspaper articles about things like the health benefits of community gardening in terms of the access that gardens provide to fresh and healthy food, to physical exercise, to opportunities for spending time in nature, the environmental benefits of community gardens in cities. And yet gardeners themselves are rarely taking the time to measure whether or not that's happening in their own gardens. And so we know about this generally, and yet any given garden is typically having a hard time seeing whether or not those good things are happening locally. And so to tie this back into the overall theme of these webinars and the work that you're doing with Alex, what I'd say is that gardens that can't measure the good things that are happening within them are missing out on an opportunity to learn about themselves. This is really a lot of what happens in gardens is an opportunity for informal environmental education, for discovering what's going on out there, but also checking in and seeing whether or not the gardening that you're doing is having the impact that you intended it to have. I used to be a community gardener in Brooklyn at a place called Prospect Heights Community Farm. And I'll share two quick stories that I think are relevant for the presentation ahead. The first is whenever we had a contentious garden meeting, and we would have these meetings every month in order to make decisions and figure out what the garden should be doing, inevitably there'd be a lot of politics involved. And at some point, my friend John, who was a leader in the garden, would sort of clear his throat. And John was the kind of guy that whenever he cleared his throat, everyone would sort of hush down and pay attention. John would clear his throat and he would carefully and patiently remind all of us that garden is a noun and a verb. It is both a product and a process. And the act of coming together and trying to figure out what we wanted to do together was just as important as the garden itself. We were creating a space where we could practice living in a democratic society together. So I always like to think about John reminding us that gardens are both noun and verb. The other thing I'd share is that there was another gardener who had been with the garden for a long time, almost since its founding, back when there were maybe only 5 or 6 people who were interested in the garden. And she had a hard time with the fact that the garden was growing. And by the time I was there, we had anywhere from 50 to 75 regular members. And whenever a new gardener would join up, she would often just sort of take them aside and very sadly tell them, you know, this used to be a very happy garden, but now it's kind of a sad garden. And really what she meant was that it used to be the kind of place that you could just go and hang out and things got done because there were only 4 or 5 people negotiating with one another. But what had happened as the garden became more popular was that the politics got bigger. You just had more voices in the mix, and we had to have difficult conversations with one another about what we wanted to do together. And so the idea of measuring the good things in our gardens, the idea of trying to track what's going on, ultimately falls out of a desire to get somewhere, to set goals and work together toward growing more food, creating more compost, providing the neighborhood with more open space and green space. Whatever it might be, the act of gardening ends up being an act of setting goals and seeing whether or not we've gotten them. So with that, let me go on to the next slide and say that the 5-Borough Farm project started off with a process of creating metrics for measuring those good things that are happening in gardens by following these 3 top rules. First, we absolutely wanted to make sure that the toolkit that we developed was relevant to what was actually going on in community gardens. And in order to do that, we convened more than 30 different gardens, representatives from more than 30 different gardens at a day-long workshop where we sat down and said, what is it that you're trying to get a better handle on that's going on in your gardens? Are you anxious to figure out whether or not you're growing enough food? Are you trying to figure out whether or not your participants are actually putting in the volunteer hours that they're supposed to? What is it that matters to you? And instead of then going off into another room behind a closed door and making that toolkit ourselves as experts, we actually engaged the gardeners in the process of making that toolkit with us so that there was direct relevance and ownership over the process from day one. The second rule we tried to follow was to make it tactile. And more often than not, when we start talking about metrics and data collection and citizen science, the first thing that pops into our head is to have a sheet of paper on a clipboard and a pencil and someone outside logging numbers on a piece of paper. And that works to some extent, but we wanted to make it more hands-on. We wanted to make it a little bit more effortless. We wanted to make the process of collecting data almost streamlined with the process of gardening itself. And so, for example, and I'll get into this in a little bit, when it comes to trying to measure how much compost we've created over some course of time, instead of having a clipboard with a pencil dangling from it next to your compost bin, we thought, why not use a dry erase marker on a white 5-gallon bucket, and you can use tally marks in order to record how many times you fill up the bucket. So the bucket itself actually becomes the worksheet, and then you could log that into a website, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So as much as possible, making the act of data collection something that's hands-on and just happens effortlessly out in the field. And of course, the third rule is trust the gardeners, which I think is inherent in the previous 2 rules. It's always tempting, particularly when you're brought in as a quote-unquote expert, to pretend that you've got all the answers. But the fact of the matter is, an initiative like this, an initiative to try to discover and learn about what's happening in a community garden, can't work unless the community gardens are on board. So first and foremost, you have to trust the participants. You have to trust the gardeners to lead the project in the right direction, in a relevant direction, and then grow from there. Now, if I had an animation on this slide, I was going to sneak in 3 more rules. I'll go over them quickly. The first is be flexible, which right away, by breaking the fact that there are 3 rules, or 6 rules in this case instead of 3, the lesson is inherent in the presentation. You have to be flexible. A project like this takes twists and turns as you're discovering together and learning together about what kinds of metrics you want to develop together, what's important to measure, what's important to leave out. The second thing I'd say is a saying from a mentor of mine named Jane Vella, who is a fantastic informal adult educator, and I encourage all of you to check out her work. She likes to say, pray for doubt. And we had a lot of skeptical gardeners in this process who said things like, well, no one's going to want to do this. or I can't see what benefit this has, or I don't even know what I'm doing here. And all of those kinds of criticism helped to make the project stronger, helped us to see where the weak spots were in this process of trying to work with partners to measure the good things that they were doing. So pray for doubt. Everyone shouldn't be on the same page. There should be difference, and there should be a discussion around it. And finally, I'd say just get ready to learn. This is part and parcel of the process of paying attention to what's going on out there and humbling yourself in order to have a successful citizen science project. Let me pause a minute, and I know that we don't have many people in attendance right now, but if anyone has any questions, I'd invite you to, again, just plop them into the chat box, and I'll do my best to weave them into the conversation. So I'm going to cover a couple of the different areas that ended up coming out of that one-day workshop that we had with community gardeners. And I'll tell you this, we had a lot of surprises in terms of what gardeners said they wanted to be able to measure. We had some obvious stuff like food production, which I'll talk about in a bit, but we had some not so obvious stuff, which I'll also talk about in a bit. And so that comes back to that idea of being flexible and being open to surprises and even praying for doubt. You never know what you're going to get in a process like this, and that ends up making it a lot more robust. So the first thing overall that everyone ended up measuring was food production, which is fairly straightforward, but takes a little bit of rigor in order to remember to, for example, like the woman in this slide is doing, weigh the tomatoes that you pick and just jot that down before you head out of the garden to make probably, salsa or tomato sauce with whatever you're making that day's harvest. We were very lucky to be able to partner with a great organization called Farming Concrete, which for 2 years prior to this project had already been working with community gardeners to use a very simple kitchen scale system for weighing and tracking the produce that they harvested in their gardens. And that starts with what they call a crop count, which is tracking the number of different plants of a particular fruit or vegetable you actually put in the ground for that season. And then the harvest count, which is exactly what it looks like, weighing the produce that comes from those plants. Farming Concrete has been a fantastic partner in this regard, and we have very luckily been able to expand their website to start to take in all of the data on all of the different things that we're trying to measure. So I always like to point out the work that Farming Concrete has done toward this. This is one of those cases where we did have to revert to just a good old-fashioned binder with a spreadsheet inside. And so sometimes that's just the way to go. The next thing that everyone was really excited about was getting a sense of how much was going on around compost. And it was really interesting to see how different gardens wanted to do this. Some were really intent on measuring the landfill waste that they diverted. So the pounds of kitchen scraps and sawdust and mulch and wood chips that they turned into compost. Within that group, some wanted to measure that by weight and some wanted to measure that by volume. And then there was a whole other group of gardens that wanted to measure the compost that actually came out at the other end. And as you'd imagine, they wanted to either do it by weight or by volume. So we worked with the gardeners to standardize these things, to understand the weight and volume conversion so that we could get a sense of comparing apples to apples across different gardens. But we were flexible and allowed the gardens that wanted to focus on what was coming in to focus on that, and the gardens that wanted to focus on what was going out to focus on that. And in this case, I'm particularly proud of the way that we handled the data tracking process. Again, instead of putting a spreadsheet out by the compost bins, we encouraged people to get white 5-gallon buckets. You can actually see something like that in this picture. Or if the compost production scale was particularly large in their garden, to get a 55-gallon drum or a standard trash can from the hardware store. And just tally off using duct tape or masking tape the 1/4 full mark, the half full mark, and the 3/4 full mark on the side of the bucket or the trash can. And every time you filled it up to a certain amount and then wanted to use up the compost that was in there, you would just track on the side of the bucket with a marker. I filled it up 1/2, I filled it up 1/4, etc. And then at the end of the season, you can just tally up all of those increments to find out how many gallons of compost you made. So that's one example of trying to get at that. Another big thing that we heard from gardeners was an effort to try to track the hours of participation that were going into gardens. And this is a really big thing in terms of securing funding from large donors, sometimes from city agencies. Gardens need to be able to prove that a lot of people are getting involved and that they're putting in their time. So we came up with two different ways of doing this. The first was doing it according to geography. We created a metric that essentially consisted of posting a large poster-sized map of your neighborhood in the garden and having push pins available. And every time someone did an hour of work, they would take a push pin and put it on top of their block, the block where they lived. And over the course of a week, you could get a sense of the geographic distribution of where people were coming from within the neighborhood to do work in the garden, but also the number of hours, which would equate to the number of push pins put on the map, that were actually donated. So you could report back to a funder or report back to a policymaker about how much work was being done in that garden. It could also give a quick visual for the folks who are in the leadership of the garden to see whether or not there really is much work going on. Another way of doing this is according to tasks. And there are just some tasks that are always happening in gardens. You're always composting, you're always watering, you're always weeding and pruning. Sometimes you're always building or making things. And so we made up little task cards that could exist in a mailbox, either on the garden fence or in the garden shed. And every time someone donated some amount of time, they would just fill out the card and plop it in the mailbox. And that would allow a garden coordinator to start to track the number of hours that were put toward watering or put toward maintaining open hours to the community. Quick and effortless and mostly visual as opposed to having to write things down. This is my favorite. We heard from a lot of gardeners that they wanted to be able to tell a story about the skills and knowledge that were already prevalent in their gardens. When people talk about the needs of community gardens, it often devolves into a conversation about gardens being dependent on large funders or on government agencies. And the fact of the matter is that most community gardens and a lot of urban farms were started by their own bootstraps, pulled up by their own bootstraps, by local volunteers coming together to make something magical happen. And so the last thing they want is to be seen as takers. They want to be seen as givers, people who have a lot to offer to their community. And so we offered a very simple, very standard community organizing asset mapping process to allow gardeners, just using sticky notes, to share with one another what skills they have and what knowledge they have about either organizing or horticulture or some combination of the two, so that they start to see in a very physical form all of the skills and all of the talents that are latent in the garden, and then start to maybe even come together to think about projects they might do together in the garden. So if someone says, I want to learn about how to grow garlic, and another gardener posts that they have excellent skills in garlic growing and have been doing that for years and years, those two people might come together and do a workshop. It's a way to not only surface all of those great assets that are in the garden, but to start to build connections between everyone. So it's both learning and networking at the same time. And from a sort of storytelling perspective, you can literally count all these things up. You can say on May 1st, we had a garden meeting. We did a community asset mapping process, and we discovered that there were 156 untapped skills in our garden. And here are some examples of them. And you can write a letter to your local assembly person or your local council person or to the local family foundation and brag about your garden as being a place that is a repository of all of these great assets. The last category, and I think this is particularly important to a lot of folks that get involved in urban agriculture and community gardening, is the idea of health and wellness. That these gardens are offering opportunities for healthier living in urban places, and in particular in places that are underserved by supermarkets that offer a wide variety of affordable fresh fruits and vegetables, or providing an opportunity for people to get some physical exercise or just spend some time in an area that's been planted with a lot of lush plants as opposed to more concrete. So we created a couple of metrics for getting at this. The first one has to do with changes in attitudes about eating vegetables amongst kids. I'm not going to get into the particulars of this because we won't have enough time, but it basically is a voting thing for kids to say whether or not they like the vegetables that they taste in a garden at any given day. And that starts to give garden organizers that work with kids a little bit of feedback about whether or not their vegetable tasting experience is actually having an impact on the kids that are there. We also did a little project about mood changing in the garden. Whenever you step into a garden, if you're feeling stressed out, we created a little mailbox full of keywords, sort of mood words like stressed or anxious or unhappy. And folks could just pick one of those and put it in a bucket, and that's them recording their feeling about how they're doing as they're heading into the garden. But then as they're leaving, they could pick another feeling word, hopefully on the positive end of the spectrum, something like hopeful or relaxed or joyous, and put that into the bucket as well. And that starts to get some sense of how people are feeling as they come in and go out. Another metric that we got at was trying to understand how people are using the food that's harvested in the garden in their kitchens. And so this involved giving out blank recipe cards and encouraging people to fill them out once they've cooked or created a meal with something that they either grew or accessed in the garden, and then share that back. And for most of these, we started to implement some very basic social media components as well. So like taking a picture of the meal that you cooked with the tomatoes that you just harvested from the garden and sharing that along with the recipe on Twitter or Facebook. All of these different metrics, and I realize that I've gone over them fairly quickly, but all of these metrics are going to be made available in a beautifully designed toolkit that's going to be published later this month by the Design Trust, along with some very detailed instructions on how you can do all of this in your own community garden or urban farm. And we see it as an open source project. If you think you might want to get in there and tinker with the idea a little bit and make it your own, that's fantastic. And we'd love to hear from you about how you did that. But keep an eye on the Design Trust for Public Space website, because that resource is going to be free and available in the very near future. And along with that, we're developing some very, very short instructional videos to help you wrap your hands around how to use these very simple metrics. So the last thing I'd say is that a project like this ultimately is about learning. It's about discovering what's actually happening in your community garden or in your urban farm, and whether or not you're getting the intended results. We all have different goals for community gardening. Some of us go in there wanting to just spend some time away from our work and find some peace and quiet. Others go in wanting to grow as many vegetables as possible to give away to a local food pantry or soup kitchen. Other folks go in not wanting a quiet experience. They actually want an opportunity to meet their neighbors and maybe have a barbecue and just hang out. And all of these things can happen in these spaces. It takes having a conversation amongst all of us as community gardeners to see whether or not those will all fit together. And then using really simple ways of checking in, like some of the metrics I just shared with you, to see whether or not we're getting any of that done, whether these gardens and urban farms are actually getting us the host of benefits that we're always bragging that they do. That pretty much wraps up my presentation, and I wonder if there are any questions.
Thank you very much, Phil. So if anyone has any questions, please type them into the chat box. But I already have a little comment or kind of question. So I feel like, I'm trying to connect this to urban environmental education theme. And I feel that to some extent, we take for granted some kind of outcomes that we're trying to measure, like knowledge or behavior, etc. But many of educators are doing, a lot of creative activities. Some of them are related to restoration of natural sites or building some green infrastructure, and the outcomes could be something like very, very different from what we have traditionally measured, like, I don't know, connection to nature, grown food, and also maybe different, the food is just one of ecosystem services, right? So we can also
Right.
talk about all kinds of cultural ecosystem services as well. And I'm not sure, I don't know if to what extent you measured it in your project. But my question is, so there's kind of on one hand there's established outcomes in urban environmental education, kind of legitimate, and there are some kind of novel outcomes. But
Hmm.
why at all would we measure them in maybe in addition to trying to get money from funders? What what is
Hmm.
the value for the community itself, for participants, whether they're kids, adults, or families, uh, to have understanding of what they are actually achieving?
Sure. That's a great
Like
question,
in
Alex.
a numerical term or in a descriptive term, etc.
Yeah. And before I answer that, it looks like Jane Conrad is asking if the microphone is off. So Jane might be having some trouble hearing us. I don't know if there's anything you can do about that, Alex. But um, my answer to that question, again, I think it's a fantastic question. There are a number of different reasons for tracking the impacts and outcomes of our work, not just in terms of community gardening or urban farms, but in terms of any sort of environmental stewardship work that we're doing in an urban context. And like Alex said, a lot of environmental education projects often have a very strong stewardship or restoration or conservation or landscape design component attached to them. So some of the reasons, I've gone over a few already. The idea of tracking how well you're doing in order to make the case to funders and policymakers that you deserve support. You deserve to continue to exist. In some cases, there might be a challenge to, I'll stick with the community gardening example. There might be a challenge to whether or not your garden should continue to exist on that particular lot or whether a building should be put there. Tracking the benefits of the garden can help you make a strong case to policymakers that the garden has a right to be there, and in fact, it's a valuable um, part of the neighborhood. So, but those are just two examples. The reason that I get particularly excited about, and Alex, thank you for teeing this up, is the idea of tracking whether or not we're getting where we want to go with our projects. And I know we have a lot of educators, both formal and informal, on the call. Um, oh, I'm just noticing that Alex is difficult to hear. I see. Well, I was going to say that there are a number of different educators on the call, both formal and informal, and educators are no strangers to evaluation. We call them tests in a formal setting. Sometimes in an informal setting, there are other forms of evaluation that we use. But, um, the idea of just taking our temperature and seeing whether or not we're getting where we want to go with our project is, I think, inherent in any of these efforts. We all get really excited about doing the neighborhood cleanup or planting the trees or starting the garden. But the idea of measuring what we're doing both forces us to take a step back and clarify our goals for what we're doing, which I find is often a challenge for some of these grassroots projects. And it forces us to then see whether or not we're actually getting there. So sometimes it's the goal setting process that's the most important part of all of this. I would say that that sort of that process of setting goals and continuously collecting data, either numbers based or more qualitative data, to see whether or not you're getting there is inherently a process of learning. It's a process of checking in and seeing what's going on and understanding whether or not you're growing, both as an individual and as a community working together. So I would say that that's the most exciting reason to do this is the opportunity to grow as a project.
Oh, thank you. Well, I hope that everybody else can hear me. I'm not sure what's my microphone, but thank you. This is a great response. And you know what? When I was in some organizations in urban environmental education in the Bronx, and I've heard from students that, well, I was surprised, that like in many organizations, students, and I guess, adults maybe in some restoration projects are kind of very reflective, becoming very reflective about what goals they're trying to achieve. Like some students would say to me, "Oh, we are going to this urban environmental education because it keeps us out of street, out of trouble, or something." And I was like, "Wow, how do you know
Mhm.
that?" the like formal or legitimate outcome is like you're getting some knowledge, but you kind of realize something else because educators kind of help them to realize some other goals. But I think it
Right.
was kind of meaningful. But
Right.
also, like yesterday, I was watching your YouTube. Okay, people cannot hear me, so I should just shut up. Uh,
Alex, what if you type your question? That might, then I can
okay,
actually repeat it back.
okay, okay.
Just to paraphrase, Alex brings up a good point. Alex is talking about his work in the South Bronx and having conversations with young people and asking them why they were engaging in environmental education. And Alex, correct me if I'm wrong, it sounded like you heard a lot of great answers, things like, this keeps me off the streets, or this helps me get ready for college, or this helps me stay focused on school. Um, and you bring up an important point, Alex, and I'm going to jump in and say, I think that and this might be slightly controversial too, so I'm just going to put that out there. I think that we all know what the standard reasons why we do any of this work are. We know what the soundbite reasons are. And it's easy to rattle those off. They're in our mission statements, they're in our goals and objectives. But we don't often take a chance to take a step back and really ask ourselves if those are still the reasons why we do it then. Or more importantly, if those reasons are shared amongst all the people involved. So while those kids may have learned to say that they were involved in oyster restoration or boat building because it kept them off the streets, it's also entirely possible that they were involved because it was just fun and they enjoyed what they were learning. So there's sometimes there might be a space between what we're taught to say about what we're doing and the actual reasons why we're doing it. And I would just suggest that it's important to have both surfaced and work with both, because you can be tracking your success toward that sort of PR or public mission statement reason why, and that's great. But unless you're actually grappling with all those other sort of hidden reasons why you're doing a thing, you might not be as successful as you'd want to be. Because in this, I'll stick with that case. If the kids are showing up because it's fun, and you've made an explicit goal to make the thing fun according to how the kids define fun, then you're going to work on getting there. But if it's just about keeping the kids off the street and getting them ready for college, and that's not really the reason why they keep showing up, there's going to be a mismatch at some point. So anyway, the thing I'd say is just get all the goals on the table in order to then actually track your success toward all of those goals together. There you go. And Alex actually just typed it. He says, I think that involving urban EE/stewardship participants into defining the goals and outcomes of their project is an educational process in itself. That's absolutely right. It's an opportunity to reflect, and then to actually see over time whether or not you're learning. So Alex also asks, and I'm reading this out loud for the sake of the recording. Alex asks, Phil, is there any theory or educational framework behind the asset mapping process that you described? I'll answer that first. We pulled that process from old-fashioned organizing stock and trade practices that we've just seen over time. I think sticky notes are the organizer's best friend, and so it probably resonates with any number of different schools of thought, from Paulo Freire's work on adult-based education to Jane Vella's dialogue education. But the idea is to get people out of their seats and sharing snippets of ideas in a way that is accessible and just not scary and not intimidating. The other thing Alex asks is, do you know any other similar educational or meeting processes to bring participants together to reflect on their environmental education or stewardship? There are hundreds probably out there. And I'll just speak to a few that have influenced me. And that's the only credential that I can give. The first is the practice of dialogue education. I've mentioned Jane Vella a couple of times, and I think it's worth looking into her work. Her books are beautifully written, they're accessible, they're meant for the practitioner, and they're just full of fantastic advice for designing learning experiences with adults that are based on their name. excuse me, and that are based on their own interests. So her name is Jane, Jane, Vella, Vella, and I just typed that into the chat as well. There's a process, well, I should just say, in Jane Vella's work is around the idea of dialogue. I'm typing that in, education. There's a process for convening and managing open meetings called open space technology. I'll type that in now, open
Oh,
space
so you can
technology.
make sure that you send it to all participants because I get it privately. The last
Send to host, I see. Send to all attendees. All right, so here we go. Jane Vella and dialogue education. That was the first thing. The second thing I mentioned is called open space technology, which is a process for convening meetings that don't have a set agenda ahead of time. And that's all I'll say about that. There's a great book on open space technology that's cheap and easy to find. I think if you Google it, there might even be a pirate version on Google somewhere, although I shouldn't admit that. But it's a way of welcoming all of the participants in a meeting to have a voice in actually framing the agenda for the meeting in an ongoing, learning-based way. I offer up those two as great places to start. Dialogue education in particular has a deep and wide history. It draws on a lot of great foundational work on organizing in adult education, so you can spend a lot of time really digging into those resources. And open space technology is being used in a lot of different contexts. And I would say just check out that book. It's a lovely little read. It's the type of thing that you can read a chapter a night and not be overwhelmed. Karen asks, the dialogue education book. Jane has a number of books out, and I'm having a hard time thinking of what to recommend. The first one you should read probably is called Learning to Listen, Learning to Teach. And I've just typed that in. I think that's probably a nice way to get started. You can also check out an organization called Global Learning Partners. Type that in, Global Learning Partners, which is a group of folks who learned from Jane a number of years ago on dialogue education and do trainings throughout the country. They also offer a lot of really great tips and tricks and tools and ideas and free resources on their website, so it's worth checking that out as well. I believe it's just globallearningpartners.org, but if you just type that into Google, you should find them quickly and easily. No problem, Karen. Thank you.
Well, Phil, I also have this kind of questions. Well, in your case, I'm pretty sure there was like a number of advanced folks who participated and helped to facilitate this process, such as asset mapping and then thinking about which outcomes to measure. But what about those situations we often have, like small groups, I don't know, friends of park or whatever, and they are trying to, like, is it desirable to build relationships or like to welcome to this dialogue some local scientists, experts, government people, I don't know, professors, or you know, like how professional, we probably also want to develop some language that is comparable between different sites. Even in your case, for example, should we measure compost by weight or by volume? But what if the whole world is already measuring it by weight, for example, but we didn't know that we measured it by volume, and now we can actually compare stuff, with. So we would need to some extent, some expert uh, opinions or something. I don't know. Do you have any comments on that?
That is a big, hairy, messy, exciting, fun, and difficult conversation. The politics of expertise in grassroots work it's a thing to study. It's a thing to really have to wrestle with. And of course, you know, as everyone knows, Alex has a PhD. I'm working toward getting one. And so it's in our vested interests to continue to find work to do, and to hold on to our expertise in some way. And so, you know, the knee-jerk response that I have to have is, yes, please do involve experts and local academics and researchers because we can help you to strengthen your project. But that's not always the case. You know, every case is different. And there are going to be instances where a local stewardship organization or a local volunteer effort just wants to go out on their own and start to figure things out for themselves. And if that's what's working, then that's what's working. There are citizen science projects that run the gamut. And in fact, I have a colleague here, Alex and I have a colleague here at Cornell who has done great work just sort of labeling different kinds of participation in these projects. And there are definitely lots of projects where there are no experts involved, and yet some really beautiful stuff happens. So there are always trade-offs. There are always pros and cons to who gets involved and who doesn't. But I would say don't wait to find the expert before you get started, or don't let that be the thing that keeps you from getting started. Because once you dig in and start your community garden or start your Friends of Parks group, as you find that you need the resources or the knowledge of some other individual, you'll go and find it. Now, I'm seeing that Gary had a question, but maybe we didn't see it. So, Jane, thank you for flagging that. Gary, can we get you to restate your question? And while we're waiting for Gary to just plunk that question back in there, if anyone else has anything that they want to throw out, please do feel free to.
Well, while we are waiting for the question, so I just
the other thing I'd say in response to Alex's previous comment is that we're all experts in one way or another about our local situation. You know, community gardeners, and that's the case that I'll stick with because that's what we're talking about mostly today. Community gardeners know their gardens inside and out. And I could walk into a garden and start to make recommendations about what should or shouldn't happen. But 9 times out of 10, I'm going to miss the obvious reasons why the thing that I think should or shouldn't happen isn't happening yet. And so we should always trust the fact that to some extent, we're all experts in our local experiences. That doesn't mean that there isn't room for other forms of knowledge. And I think it's best to think of it that way. There isn't expertise or lack of expertise. There are just different forms of knowledge. There's always going to be room for different forms of knowledge. It's a matter of respecting what you've got and honoring what you've got when you start to work on something, and seeing that initial starting off point as being rich with assets. Don't look at your projects as being asset poor. You're always starting off with some amount of local knowledge, even if it's just you sitting at a table figuring out what to do next. So just keep that space. All right, so here we go from Gary Bowen. What kinds of locations are used? Empty lots, roofs, parks, etc. Are they all included? Yes, Gary. We pitched a big tent in order to do Five-Borough Farm. And so in New York City in particular, there are well over 500 empty lots. Well, they're not empty, of course, because gardens are in them, but lots formerly occupied by buildings, let's say that, that currently have gardens within them. But folks that are growing on top of their roofs, folks that are growing in parks, there are instances in New York City of slices of public parks being turned over to horticultural production. Yep, we included all of that. There really isn't anything about site location that necessarily precludes the use of any of these tools in the toolkit. I think what's more important is that it be a group process. Most of these tools are focused on gardening together as opposed to gardening individually. There are some that are applicable to someone who might be growing in their own backyard, but given that you're all educators to some extent, or at least curious about education, I think you're probably working with a group in some way, even if it's young people. Jane asks, any vertical gardens? Not that I know of, although there might be some cases of vertical gardening in some of the gardens we worked with last year. And I know that a lot of community gardeners trellis, which is a form of vertical gardening that we've been doing for millennia. But in terms of the more sophisticated or high-tech vertical gardens, I don't think we had any cases. But again, it's entirely possible. It's just a matter of weighing the fruits and vegetables that you pick off of the green wall as opposed to what you got out of your raised bed. Great questions.